the age of Aquarius. This is like that's actually a very modern concept, the age of Aquarius, not a traditional idea. Not that it matters or not. There's lots of new great concepts in modern astrology too, but the ancient meaning of the sign of Aquarius, it was a sign that was ruled by Saturn. And Saturn as a planet was the dimmest and most distant of the visible planets before we knew about the Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, the outer planets. And as such, it was thought of as the gatekeeper between the material world and something that was transcendental that lay beyond this world that was connected to it. So the ancient astrologers, for example, believed that the Ade or the Archai, these archetypal thoughts, like very like Platonic, like these thoughts in the mind of God or the mind of the universe, existed in this transcendental realm, and this realm was a reflection, a kind of material, embodied, but always fluctuating reflection of those forms. The planets are thought to bring those forms down into the world, and it's their interactions that govern the expression of life in the world, and that's the patterning of the universe, so to speak. Well, when you think about Saturn's rulership of Aquarius, what we're talking about as light is rising out of the winter, and we're in sort of the middle of winter, but the light steadily rising toward the spring. Saturn is the ruler of this sign because Saturn marks the threshold between the limits of this world and the beginning of the archetypal world. And as such, the sign was associated with the distinctions we draw between this world and its possibilities, or its failures, or its shortcomings, or its potentials, measured against ideals that come in from time to time in like an industry, like a technological revolution that says, here's where you've been, here's the limits of where you've been, here's AI, right? This is Pluto entering Aquarius right now. Or here's where you've been, here's the limits of where you've been, it's been monarchy. Now we're going to try democracy. So these thresholds that Saturn brings forth in the sign of Aquarius have to do with sort of pitting an old way of doing something against a new archetypal possibility. And then it becomes about the polarization between the old and the new. So Pluto and Aquarius taking place at such a charged moment historically, in terms of the environment, the political climate right now, the divisiveness. A lot of this is happening because Pluto's really a god of transformation, change, death, and rebirth, the lord of the underworld that stirs things up, that revitalizes and renews, but also sort of transfigures. And there's a process of death and rebirth that's like fundamental to Pluto. So here Pluto comes through this sign of Aquarius, where the way that that death and rebirth process takes place is through a comparison of new ideals versus old structures. And it can be very polarizing. There can be a lot of division around, well, what's the right ideal? Like you had a major period of, even war when Pluto was last in Aquarius with respect to what is the ideal form of human governance. So I think it's really interesting on the level of technology, medicine, even things like astrology, I think stand to be thought of differently, to be thought of more like almost like a poetics of experience. Like nobody doubts the validity of music, right? To be able to speak to and convey something of the human experience. And music is healing, and it does a lot of things that are very tangible that no one doubts the empirical reality of. Astrology is very similar to music in that respect. And again, it was compared to music by ancient astrologers, and much of the original theory was encased in musical theory even. But the point of this to me is that we're at a period where something like astrology, something like the technology of yoga, sound healing, gemstones, so many things that you might put in the woo-woo bin, have the potential during a Pluto and Aquarius period to be looked at more seriously, as does, I think, different ways of living and relating as people who share civic culture and civic and social in the social arena. And but it can be a very charged period too, like with respect to what ideas are going to light the way into humanity's future. The other thing that's very fascinating about the sign of Aquarius is that the myth of the water pourer, that is the constellation image, is the water pourer is Ganymede, who's this fascinating figure. He's like this very beautiful, promising example of a human being that Zeus falls in love with and then transforms into an eagle or sends his eagle and abducts him, pulls him up to Olympus, and then he becomes his cupbearer. Well, one of the roles of a cupbearer is to drink to make sure that the king's not going to get poisoned, right? That's a fascinating thing, to recruit a human that you are enamored by as a god to come up and protect you from death, even though you can't die. I'm not the first person to remark on this story, of course, but one of the things that's so fascinating about this is that in Greek culture and philosophy and mythology, it's not just a one-way conversation where the gods are above us and we are enamored by them and we worship them. That's all a part of the story, but there's this other exchange that happens where the gods are often enamored by and fascinated with us. Heraclitus once famously said that the gods live beyond us, but we die beyond them. And so there's something in mortality that the gods are just totally fascinated by in Greek mythology and enamored by. And so in this exchange with Ganymede, you have this a human that gets to be right next to the gods, that's elevated to Olympus, you know. But in that, Ganymede is alienated. He's abducted. He's dissociated from the earth, from his people. And then also in his proximity to Zeus, Zeus gets to experience something mortal. And that's the proximity to the cup of poison that the mortal has to drink on his behalf, if that makes sense. So long story short, we have in the sign of Aquarius a fascination on the human level with things that are other and distant and sort of above us or beyond us somehow. The technology, the AI, the aliens, the UFOs, the technology of ancient Egypt, all of that stuff is like exploding right now. It's Pluto's in Aquarius. At the same time, there's a way in which, like, for example, the long history of human fascination with the stories of alien abduction, regardless of its factual history, right? Because I believe that probably things have happened. But on an archetypal or a psychological level, I think there is a longing to be taken up by things that are beyond us, to be enveloped and taken away from this world and exposed to something that is somehow beyond this world. Again, because this world there's suffering that we have to reconcile ourselves with. So this sign also holds out this really interesting promise, which is to have us look more carefully at how valuable and beautiful it is to be human. That in our impermanence, in our animal bodies, in an ecological awareness, that there is something that even higher beings are in love with. So we can be in love with it. We don't always have to be looking for the next higher, greatest thing. On the other hand, the same exact transit of Pluto through Aquarius can kind of put us in touch with things that could truly improve upon the human experience because we're exposed to something higher. And isn't that interesting how an alien, the image of an alien, literal or not, embodies so much of that? Are they here to enlighten us, you know, or are they a threat to our dignity, our nobility as animals? Like, what are they? So not surprisingly, as Pluto entered Aquarius, like the UFO phenomenon just like shot through the roof. And it's interesting because I talked about that as a possibility given the unique history of the sign of Aquarius back in 2021, when we had Jupiter and Saturn enter Aquarius together. I said, you know, it'd be really interesting if the interest in UFOs and aliens went up when Pluto entered Aquarius. I wasn't expecting it to be like this, though. It's been pretty interesting. But anyway, those are a few things that I think make this upcoming period just really, really fascinating. That's the Pluto in Aquarius. And then there's, you know, Jupiter going into Cancer. You've got Saturn and Neptune going into Aries. You've got Uranus going into Gemini. It's a mid-decade shift of epic proportions in terms of the long, slow-moving planets changing signs, which really it creates a kind of shift in the zeitgeist. So, you know, most astrologers this year are just taking a lot of time to try to work through all of these big outer planetary shifts that are happening at once.
Hey there, Inspired Evolutionary. If you absolutely loved this, well then here's a full conversation with this guest on the Inspired Evolution podcast. Check it out now.